Today we're going to begin our discussion on the Middle Ages, specifically feudalism. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer two questions. First, why did the people of Western Europe turn to feudalism? And secondly, what were the roles of each of the social classes in European feudalism? So let's start out with the why. Feudalism actually gets its start in invasions. By this point in time, around the 800s or so, Rome had already fallen. And there was no centralized government, meaning no one big government to control the whole of Europe. And by the 800s, between 800 and about 1000, several invaders started to come into Europe. By this point, Charlemagne and Clovis had tried to establish empires, but these invasions helped to destroy those new empires. And the three groups that are responsible for this are the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Muslims. So let's start by talking about the Vikings. The Vikings are from Scandinavia. Scandinavia would be present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And these are very warlike people. The typical, Viking with the red beard and the big muscles and the horned helmets is what most people think of when they think of Vikings. And they had names like Eric Bloodaxe and Thornfinn Skull Splitter. But again, these are very warlike people, but they used the sea to invade, and they're most known for their use of these ships. And these warships are really, really important to their ability to invade. These ships usually carried up to about 300 men, and they used around 72 oars to move them. Their ends are often carved into, sea monsters and other types of sculptures. Now, each of these ships could weigh up to 20 tons, but sail in as little as 3 feet of water because they tended to have more of a flat bottom, which distributed the weight more evenly. This meant that the Vikings didn't have to invade using the sea per se, but could actually sail into harbors or into rivers to invade. And by about 1000, Leif Erikson had reached North America. And a lot of people, when they think of the discovery of North America, they think Christopher Columbus, but Leif Erikson made it to North America 500 years before Columbus did. The Vikings actually stopped their raids due to a couple of things. First, the acceptance of Christianity. When the Vikings start to accept Christianity, they have to take on this nonviolent aspect that Christians often take. A second reason that these raids by the Vikings stopped was because of a warming trend in Scandinavia. Scandinavia is really quite far north, which means that their growing season is short. And in order to sustain a large population, they needed resources, and they got those resources by invading. But when you start to see a warming trend throughout the earth, when there's a rise in temperatures, that meant that they could have a longer growing season and didn't have to invade. The second and third groups were the Magyars and the Muslims. The Magyars are originally from Hungary. That's in East Europe. They are good horsemen, and they started to invade in the late 800s. They sold many of their captives as slaves. They're very similar to the Mongols. And then the Muslims we have invading from the south. Remember, by this point in time, the Muslims had started to move across northern Africa, and they're making their way into Spain. And so their goal is to not only conquer, but also to plunder. They're out to take over and destroy and to get as much from the places that they conquer as possible. So there's really these three groups that are basically causing widespread fear and chaos in Western Europe. And many of these early kings were just really ineffective at defending their people. They didn't have the armies that were necessary to defend against these Vikings and the Magyars and the Muslims. So rather than looking to the king, instead they look away from the central authority, away from the king, to local rulers who have sort of like their own henchmen, their own military to be able to protect them. And this leads essentially to what is known as feudalism. So what is feudalism? Well, technically, it is a system of governing and land holding. Basically, what this means is that it's very similar to the feudalism that we talked about in Japan, where it's an exchange for land for loyalty, and there are obligations between these groups of people. There are three basic functions to feudalism, and we'll first start talking about the political. That is sort of the government side of it. And this has to do with, because there is no central government, Rome's gone, there's no king. In the absence of that strong central government, the defense is provided by these local governments, and this provides stability. So how does it provide stability? Well, there are a couple different groups that we're going to look at. First, the lord. The lord is a landowner. And he's the one, because he holds the land, he's the one that holds the power. Then you have the peasants and the serfs. That is the people who live on the lord's land. A serf is a particular type of peasant, and these particular kind of peasants were not allowed to leave the place where they were born. So whatever land they were born on, that's where they stayed. Everything that they contributed went directly to the lord, and if the lord lost that land, the serfs kind of went with them. The other group were the knights, or vassals, and a vassal is anyone who receives a fief. So a fief is land that is granted by the lord, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So the lord protects his serfs by using his own personal army, that is, the knights. In return for that protection, the peasants and the serfs work the land for the lord, because each of these lords could own thousands of acres of land. Now the lord gives a fief. Remember, the fief is the land granted by a lord. So anybody, and there could be lords and lesser lords that are included as a vassal. Anybody who receives these fiefs is called a vassal. And so the lord gives a fief to a vassal. In return, the knight or the vassal protects the lord's land. So basically how this works is this guy here holds all the land. He's getting it worked by the peasants and the serfs, who are being protected by the knights. The fief, this land, is given to the vassals in return for that protection. This is a very important concept to understand, so please make sure that you understand that. If you don't, please see me if you have questions. The second of the functions is social. And the social meaning, like interactions between people. Each class of people is responsible for certain, they have certain responsibilities, and they owe things above and below them. So let's take a look at what's known as a feudal pyramid. This is oftentimes compared to the Japanese feudal pyramid. So at the top you have the king. The king is the one who holds the most land. He then divvies it out to the lords. These are the wealthy landowners. And the lords were considered to be of noble blood. So this oftentimes means that they are known as the nobility. During the 14th century, only about 1% of the entire population were considered to be of noble blood and therefore could own land. The other group of lords would be the bishops. That is the sort of upper class of the church, because the church oftentimes held land as well. The lords and the knights are all vassals. And all of the vassals are required to provide military service, either directly or through their sons. The knights are the military. They are promised to defend the lord in return for that fief. Oftentimes, the knights were the sons of upper lords, and they practiced something called chivalry, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Below them, you have the peasants. These are landless people. They are not of noble blood, therefore they are not a vassal. They cannot hold a fief. Then you have the serfs. The serfs, as we mentioned before, are the lowest class. They are bound to the land. They are provided with food. Everything that they produce goes directly to the Lord. So let's sort of jump back a little bit to chivalry. Chivalry deals with the knighthood, and the idea of chivalry was a code of conduct for knights, and it required that they fight bravely for three masters: their lord, their god, and their chosen lady. These were the people that were out to protect the weak and the poor. Chivalry is oftentimes compared to the warrior class of Japanese feudalism, that is the samurai, and their code of conduct, Bushido. In order to become a knight, you had to have specific kinds of training. At the age of 7, you would be sent to the castle of another lord where you would become that lord's page, where you would wait on your host and begin to practice some of those fighting skills. At the age of 14, you would become what was known as a squire, that is a servant for a knight. And then at 21 years old, you would become a full-blown knight, and you would practice your fighting skills at tournaments. Think jousting, and those kinds of knightly games that you've probably seen in the movies. The third function is economic, and this deals with the manor. Each of the lord's land would be considered a manor, the lord's estate. And these were self-sufficient agricultural communities where everything that you would need would be produced within the manor. So let's look at the manor itself. The manor usually consisted of a couple of different things. First, the lord's house. In this particular picture, it's called the manor house. The church, and this would oftentimes be a Roman Catholic church. Workshops, like the mills, and the fields. There would often be woods for hunting, and it would be somewhere near some sort of water, pond or a stream. And usually the mill is where people would grind down their grains to make things like flour, would oftentimes be near that source of water so that it would be a source of energy. They use something called the three-field system. This is where one plot of land is left fallow or unseeded for 1 year, and they would rotate it. So in this picture, you have all of your spring planting would be done here, autumn planting would be done here, and this would be left without any kind of plants on it. And then it would rotate, so maybe the next year this would be fallow, this would be spring, and this would be autumn. And that would ensure that each year new nutrients would be taken out and new nutrients would be put in depending on the kind of crops that you used. The manor, though, like today's society, was not free of taxes. In fact, they had heavy taxes. The lord would put taxes on all kinds of things. For example, on all of the grain that was ground in the lord's mill, you would have to pay a tax. And if you even baked bread someplace other than the lord's oven, which you can see here, that was considered to be a crime. But people oftentimes did this to try to avoid the tax. Another big tax that people had to pay was something called a tithe. And this is a 10% tax of your income that goes directly to the church. So what was life like on the manor for these people? To say it was bad would be an understatement. Many times they would have large families, that is, they would have a lot of children, but not many of them made it to adulthood. Diseases ran rampant through the manor. And that's because this is not someplace that's known for cleanliness. They lived in small 2-room cottages. The main room was used for cooking, eating, and other household activities, while the second room was the bedroom, and that was for everyone. In order to stay warm at night, they would often bring in animals like the pigs to sleep with to keep warm, and they slept on bug-infested haystacks. There was no running water, there was no toilets, so again, diseases ran rampant through these manor houses. As soon as they were old enough, children had to work. Illness, malnutrition was big during this time period. In fact, the average life expectancy was only around 35 years, which means for many of you, you're already middle-aged. So what's the big idea? The big idea when it comes to feudalism or manorialism, whatever it is you want to call it, is that this is a social system. That is how people work, connected with a political system, that is the defense that these people were providing, the lords were providing, and an economic system, this agricultural, self-sufficient community. At this point, if you go back to the beginning, take a look at those questions, make sure that you can answer them. If you cannot thoroughly answer them, please look through this video again, or take a look through your textbook, or come to me with questions tomorrow. Thank you.